What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden-Wood here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And this is a guest I've actually wanted to get on going back to November, but never before has a confluence of events come together that this episode is going to be as timely as it is. So for those of you who don't know and don't follow, you absolutely should. Today's guest is Robert Bryce, who is the author of the book, A Question of Power. Also the podcast host of the Power Hungry podcast. And I know you've written some other books, but we'll talk about that. Robert, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Glad to be with you, David.
So talk to me about your most recent book, especially in the context of everything we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about levelized cost of energy. We're going to talk about nuclear or atomic, as some of your guests would like to say, wind and solar and oil and gas and coal. Your background, the book, tell me how you got to this point before we dive right in.
Sure. Well, I guess, David, and thanks again for having me on. My latest book is A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. At the same time I was writing the book, I finished the documentary. I co-produced the documentary Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, which is now available on Roku channel for free. It's on Amazon Prime, on all your favorite documentary outlets, Curiosity Stream. And doing that, I started that in 2016. I had a contract for a book from my publisher, Public Affairs. This is my sixth book. My first book was on Enron, now almost 20 years ago. But as I was thinking about writing the book, I thought, well, I'll make a film at the same time. How hard can it be? Well, it's pretty hard. I don't recommend it. But nevertheless, I got them done. And what I found in my career, very briefly, is just that each book led to the next one. And so as I was thinking about my book that I published in 2014, Smaller, Faster, Lighter, Denser, Cheaper, How Innovation Keeps Proving a Catastrophe Wrong, I kept looking at electricity and realizing, well, this is the key commodity. Thank you. Yes, this is the key commodity. And so I realized, well, yeah, let me focus on that and look at the world through the lens of electricity. And as we found in the past 3 or 4 weeks, people have found that electricity kind of matters and they think it might be important, which is great for me and great for the book, but it's also, the blizzard was terrible and people died, dozens of people died who should not have died. And so what I'm trying to do now is use the blizzard and what's happened to underscore the importance of electricity and the fact that we ignore the importance and the fragility of the electric grid at our extreme peril.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And you know, obviously being a long-term upstream oil and gas guy, and for those who've read the blog, as I've pivoted more to energy, what I realized was as long as oil and gas in particular was affordable and reliable and cheap, and you never had to think about it, it was very easy to vilify. And so almost we were a victim of our own success, that when we kept oil at 50, gas at the pumps at 225 or 250, natural gas has been 2 or 225 in MCF for years. So consumers have become used to, you know, flip the lights, very inexpensive, very cheap. Oh, Teslas are super easy to charge. And we never really thought about it. And then, as you said, the Texas event brought all these eyes on the fragility, and the narrative got hijacked right away. And I think you said it on one of your podcasts. I love the quote. It was like all the wind guys have all the congressmen on speed dial, and they all went right there and they said, no, guys, you need to understand it's not the wind. And the explanation is so crazy, because it's not the wind, because we don't expect it to blow in the winter. So they were performing basically where we thought. And in my mind, I'm thinking, but our whole future is building more of these things that we know don't work when we need them. And then we need something else as backup. And somehow there's a disconnect. So what is your take on
that's exactly right. It's the messaging has been so clear, and it's been laughable, frankly, and more than a little maddening. And I'll just start by saying, this event, this blizzard, it has radicalized me in some ways, in that throughout my career, and particularly the last few years, I've tried to be kind of diplomatic in how I approach some of these issues. And it's not that I don't want to be diplomatic or polite, but it's, no, this event should be, following the California blackout, should be the biggest kind of wake-up call to all of these environmental groups and policymakers who are saying, we need to electrify everything. We need to quit using hydrocarbons. No, that's wrong. And in fact, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous. And the fact is that in this blizzard, people's lives were saved because of hydrocarbons. And the idea that we should quit using natural gas and propane and butane in the wintertime, are you crazy, man? I mean, are you absolutely crazy? This is the difference between surviving a severe winter storm, and that's what this was. I mean, it was severe. It was sub-freezing here in Austin for 6 straight days, which I've never seen before. But Lauren, my wife, and I, thank our lucky stars, we had a natural gas connection. We had hot water. We could make hot coffee. We could make hot food, which was a salvation when we were, when we're blacked out. And the idea that we're going to, that's just one issue. And then the key conceit, or the biggest danger is this idea, oh, we'll put all of our energy load on a single grid, the electric grid. At the same time they're saying this, the electric grid is failing in California and Texas. I mean, it's as though there's no reality for some of these people, that they're saying, oh, well, we're just going to put all of our eggs in one energy basket. Well, what happens when that fails? As it does, and we've seen, then we have not just a bad incident, we have catastrophe. So I really, I get passionate about it because, one, this is what I've done for the last 25, 30 years of my life, studying the energy business. And this moment, this blizzard, these events, and this conceit and the silliness that we're going to convert everything to renewables. And the message, as you said, oh, well, of course, we didn't expect them to show up. All we need to do is build more of them. Well, these are the same people that have already collected tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for building a whole system with transmission and everything, that when the electric grid in Texas was this close to collapse, they didn't show up. And I just think that's it's not just unpardonable, it's unforgivable. I mean, it just is. It really has got, as my dad would say, got my back up.
Well, so first of all, I love the passion, and I think that part of the problem, at least as I see it, so we're going to dive into a lot of these topics, but from a macro level, you have these competing interests, and so first and foremost, you have the trade associations, which are being driven by the large companies like Exxon. So I'll use as an example the American Petroleum Institute trade association, supposed to be representing the interests of the industry, really, in my opinion, does exactly what Exxon does. And Exxon, to preserve jobs, is the way I would say it, they continue to be pushed down the ESG path. So recently they added 2 members to their board of directors who, for all intents and purposes, want to end their business model. So I don't know how that works. BP has come out and said they're going to move big time in renewables. I saw on LinkedIn, they said, we think our renewables can generate 8 to 10%. The same time that article came out, EOG is coming out saying we have double premium locations that can get 40% rate of return at $40. And I've been out of school for a long time, but when I think about economics and the present value of things, having a 40% return is a lot better than an 8% return. And it seems crazy that these large organizations and large trade organizations aren't attacking the problem with the passion, as an example that you are. Because I think the number one misleading thing, so that's where we're going to start the topic, is the concept of the levelized cost of energy that everyone always points to. And so I want to start there. Can you explain to listeners what it is? And then let's talk about why it's a little bit misleading with some examples, but what is it? And
Sure.
do you think it's
Sure.
an effective measure?
Well, it's a misleading measure. And it's cited a lot of times about, oh, well, if you're going to build a new plant, and the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, publishes this data every year, and they project forward that if you're going to build a power plant in, it's like 3 or 4 years ahead, they estimate what that levelized cost of energy delivered will be. But it's a misleading number because it's only the price of the electricity at the wholesale market. So it is particularly for renewables, for wind and solar, it represents an incomplete picture of the grid and how it operates. So sure, you can build, and I have solar panels on the roof of my house. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar. I got 3 different subsidies for putting them on there. But the argument from the renewable guys is, oh, well, we could produce a kilowatt hour of electricity for only 2 cents or 3 cents or 4 cents. Okay, well, that's true. And you can feed it into the wholesale power market at that level, you claim. But then that ability of the solar and wind guys to free ride on the existing generation, which is exactly what has happened in Texas, that cost is not accounted for. And what I think is already clear is that the lessons that will be shown, what the realities of the near collapse of the Texas grid and the costs associated with that are going to show the big lie here, which is, oh, well, these are cheaper. Well, no, they're only cheaper if you don't account for all of the other services from natural gas in particular that have to be ready and available and are not currently being compensated in order to keep the grid from collapse.
Well, and I think that's, so I recently went through Xcel Energy's 10K because I was very curious, and I was trying to make the point on the levelized cost that so in Texas you have 29,000 of installed megawatts of wind.
Yeah,
and
about that, yeah.
during the peak of the crisis, it was maybe 7, it was 4, now that normal conditions is back to 12. The point being, you couldn't rely on it. And therefore,
exactly.
Natural gas, as I've seen, stepped up to fill the hole as it would. And it's the fastest to ramp up. It's faster than coal. It's faster than nuclear. It's the swing producer. But because everywhere was cold, Xcel Energy, over the course of those 5 or 6 days, spent $1.2 billion extra to buy gas at the spot market to keep Minnesota and Colorado residents warm. And so the shocking thing about that is twofold. Number one is that's 10% of their total revenue for all of 2020 was incurred in 6 days. Now, number two, when they disclosed what their hedging program was, they themselves, so they must be front loaded based on the numbers, but they hedged about 70+% of natural gas customers, but only 20% of electrical generation. And so at least when I think about the levelized cost of energy, and we'll talk about the electrification of the grid, but you have to include the surge cost of the backup supply. And since you can't snap your fingers to make wind and solar on, you have to pay spot rates for these other things. That is something I really hope gets talked about a lot more, because it's crazy. What do you think about how we get a conversation around the true costs and the true trade-offs to occur in the media, in the utilities, and most honestly with the customers?
David, that's the big challenge, is that the money, the media, and the momentum are all on the side of the renewables. I mean, if you looked at the New York Times in the immediate aftermath of the blizzard, it was as though, again, that big wind had every journalist in Washington and New York on speed dial. Quick, write a story that says it's not wind's fault. Well, wait a minute. We spent tens of billions of dollars building wind capacity, and now you're saying, oh, don't blame us. Well, then why did we make that? Was all, if you look at it then in terms of the grid resilience, that was all malinvestment. That was all malinvestment. Now, okay, you can argue, well, some of it we can harvest that wind in the summer and so on when we don't really need it. But if we want to look at what the possibility of total collapse of the Texas grid would have meant, I mean, it would have been a catastrophe of unlike anything we've seen in the United States. And so these issues about how to communicate this, that is the key, is that Texas was on the verge of collapse. And, oh, the New Yorkers and Californians, oh, well, that's fine. Screw Texas, right? I'm not here to brag on Texas. I'm from Oklahoma. I root for the Oklahoma Sooners, right? But the reality is that the narrowness with which we avoided total collapse should shock everyone into coming back to their senses and saying, wait a minute, we need to be really clear about what it is that is the foundation of our society. And that, I think, has to be the message, that yes, climate change is a concern. It's not the only concern.
So I want to talk about the power sources starting from the beginning, and we're going to talk trade-offs, because I think that the key thing here is education, and that every power source has trade-offs, and there are some that are better than others, and we need to move. But I want to start with atomic or nuclear, because a lot of people who fight against the nuclear narrative, but beyond 3 Mile Island and disasters, but they kind of point to Georgia's recent experience with Vogtle And the last two units, which will generate, I think, around 1,100 megawatts each, is estimated to cost somewhere around $26-27 billion, at least as of right now. So that's kind of like 13,000 an installed kilowatt, which would put it at the high end of everything that's going on, plus regulatory, etc. What do you make of nuclear, atomic? Why is it so hated? Like we used to spend 13,000 a kilowatt on solar and on wind, and because we made those investments, costs have come down. Nuclear, and then also tie France into this, because I know France was really against their program, and now they've kind of come back thinking it may be the way of the future.
Well, yeah, these are all the key issues that have to be dealt with. And let me preface it by just making a couple of quick points. One is that the autopsy of the Texas blackouts is continuing, but and it's gruesome, really gruesome, because now it's clear that taxpayers, ratepayers rather, are going to be on the hook for billions of dollars in costs. But when you look at what happened and you look the autopsy results, some of them already, it's clear that the nuclear plants in Texas perform better than any other form of generation, and that the possibility, in fact, that there was a testimony last week by the head of Vistra that their Comanche Peak reactors were 3 minutes away from shutting off.
The nuclear ones, which, as I read, was because the water which is used to cool the pipes, the inlet pipes froze or something, so they couldn't.
I'm not sure about why Comanche Peak came so close to shutdown, but in any case, the blizzard proved yet again the importance of having baseload power from nuclear, and yet we have heard nothing. The Senator or Secretary Granholm, the new Energy Secretary, gave a speech at CERA Week earlier this week, did not use the word nuclear one time. She mentioned advanced reactors, but that was, we need to build hundreds of gigawatts of clean energy. That's what she said, hundreds and hundreds. No mention of nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonization, yeah, we can talk about plants that are being built now or ones that are in the future, advanced reactors. We need to keep the reactors that are in place and operating now open. And yet the Democrats won't even talk about this. I wrote about this in Forbes last year. We have now reactors, the Byron and Dresden reactor plants in Illinois slated for closure this year, as well as Indian Point Unit 3 slated for closure next month in April. Those plants should be kept open. And instead, the Democrats as a group are saying, oh, we're going to finance all these other offshore wind and more of this, more of that, and transmission. Well, do the easy things first. You have high-paying union jobs. Anyway, so nuclear faces, to answer your question, what are the key problems? It's cost, it's time to construction, and the fact that the Vogtle plant is the first of its kind in the United States, and therefore the costs are significantly higher. But the nuclear issue is one that I'm passionate about it as well, but the industry is just stuck.
No, so the Indian Point one is a really interesting example because, again, I'd hate to be a cynic, but the same way Aubrey McClendon created coal and CO2 as the boogeyman in 2004 to create a home for his product, which ultimately led to natural gas getting to $10 or $12 an MCF. And then fracking was developed in the level that it was. So now costs came back down. So it was kind of like counterproductive. But I've always felt like we're replacing things that have long, useful life remaining. And so like the Indian Point nuclear facility in New York, as I understand it, I think this is your number, but it's on something like 250 acres of land, and it can power enough things that it would take 300,000 acres of wind to generate the same amount of power. And that we really don't think about the trade-off of what that wind is, the view shed impact. Forget birds, I don't really care about birds, but I don't like the flashing red light. I know from oil and gas that tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, there's erosion, there's degradation, and we're not having that conversation. But why are we so proactively shutting these facilities down now when they might have 10 years of useful life, when technology might advance even further?
Well, follow the money. Follow the money. And that's the oldest maxim in politics. I wrote a piece, published it a few weeks ago, again in Forbes, pointing out that today federal tax incentives for solar are 250 times on a per unit of energy produced basis, 250 times as large as the ones given to nuclear. The wind energy gets 160 times more in federal tax incentives than nuclear. Well, this is wrong. I mean, if we're serious about decarbonization, why aren't we giving some federal love? And we have to call it subsidies because that's what it is. Why are we subsidizing these forms of intermittent energy that require vast amounts of land at the very time we're seeing massive rural backlash against the installation of these projects, when we could keep existing nuclear plants online and operating if only we show them a little love? But that's not happening. And the Biden administration has made no mention of it. On the inauguration day, I wrote a piece saying the first thing Biden should do is save the existing nuclear plants. But you mentioned birds. I'm passionate about birds. I'm an avid bird watcher, and I write about birds in my newsletter. But it's not just birds. It's bats. It's insects. The problem with wind in particular, and I'm a longtime critic and proudly so, is that these land use impacts aren't just about people, they're about wildlife and view sheds and landscapes. And people around the world are saying, we don't want these. And yet this is an effort by a lot of people, just Bigfoot rural areas and force them down their throats. It's what's happening in New York.
Well, there's a book, I'm sure you've read it. I think it's by a Wall Street Journal journalist. I can't remember his name right now. I think his last name's Gold, but it's Superpower. And it talks about the trouble building transmission lines from your home state of Oklahoma to get into Tennessee, where they had planned on a whole bunch of nuclear facilities, never built them. So they have massive transmission capability. But that the real issue is when you're bringing wind, landowners don't like high power lines going across their land. States don't want to put coal workers out of jobs to bring in this energy that's all benefiting. So we have these trade-offs. Now, one of my favorite episodes of yours is the Kawaii Hawaii electric system, because I thought it was so instructive, because I'd never really thought about how isolated Hawaii is. Obviously it is, but no natural gas, so everything has to come in on a ship. Because of the view shed issue, wind is really not an acceptable source, and so they built out this massive solar complex. And as I remember from the episode, the cost of power in Hawaii in that case is 33 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas on the mainland, the average is 12 cents. And each resident uses about 25% of what we use on the mainland. Our average is 12,000 a kilowatt hour per person on mainland, and theirs is like roughly 3,000 because they don't need heat, they don't need to cool, etc. So what can we learn from solar, and why is solar, given that it's so much more expensive than even wind, why are so many people pushing it as a reasonable answer?
Well, my first response, David, would be that I think that solar is going to grow more rapidly in a lot of places than wind will. And that's a function of its higher power density, roughly 10 watts per square meter versus 1 watt per square meter for wind. The power density, by the way, at Indian Point in New York is about 2,000 watts per square meter. So 3 orders of magnitude greater than wind. And a couple, if I've got my digits right, 2 more, 2 orders of magnitude greater than solar. But I think the issue of the ability of solar and storage, solar and batteries for many locations is very attractive. And so that's going to be one reason why we're going to see it grow. And you can also put it closer to demand centers, right? Because you've got the higher power density, but it still requires a lot of land. And so, but nevertheless, rooftops on top of Walmart, other places, this can make some economic sense. But there's no such thing as a free lunch, as you were saying before. One of the emerging problems, and it's a big one in the solar business, is the sourcing of polysilicon. Well, a lot of the polysilicon now being used globally comes from China. And not only does it come from China, it comes from Xinjiang, which is the province where the Chinese authorities are involved in a brutal crackdown, and some have considered it genocide against the Uyghurs. And that some of the reports that the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority there, are in forced labor camps that are being used to produce polysilicon. Well, suddenly solar doesn't look so appetizing after all. So there's no free lunch, but I still think that some of these things, some of these supply chain issues, maybe the chemistry of some of these solar panels can be changed. But still, right now that this is tarnishing in a big way the solar sector.
Well, and it was interesting. I did a little fun video for those who've seen it. I went out to the Denver Federal Center on 6th Avenue in Kipling. It was one of the early. Colorado had moved to a 10% renewable mandate in 2004. They were the first state to do so. They then built a 1 megawatt solar farm for $6.9 million. Now, I kind of got in trouble because they said, well, technology and things have come down a lot. But I wanted to clarify with you, because you're the expert. If I build a 1 megawatt plant of coal, natural gas, nuclear, that's the output that it can consistently generate. But if I build a 1 megawatt solar farm, it's only sunny to the levels, and the efficiency is about 20%. So even on a levelized cost of energy, when we talk about the installed cost per megawatt, on solar and wind, we're talking peak megawatts, which are usually like 20%, like the average is 20% at that peak, whereas the other power plants are steady. So there's like a 5x multiplier, even just in the math, beyond the backup. Do you agree with that calculation? And is it willfully being misled, or is it just happens to be the math, do you think?
Well, okay, so first about this expert thing, my dad said an expert's anybody from out of town. So if I'm from out of town, maybe I qualify. But the term of art is the capacity factor, right? The industry phrase. So the capacity factor for solar, depending on where it's located, is roughly, it's in the 20% range. For wind, in the 30% range, and for offshore wind, the claims are in the 40% range and maybe a little bit higher. By comparison, nuclear plants run at greater than 90%. And for many of them, they'll run at 95, 98% capacity factor. That is, if they're rated at 2,000 megawatts, they will produce 2,000 megawatts 98% of the minutes in a year or a day or a month, or you pick your time frame. Coal plants similarly generally have fairly high capacity factors of the order of 60, 70%. Gas is a little bit less generally, because a lot of the gas is used for the gas-fired power plants are used for peaking rather than baseload, but they can be used for baseload as well. So when you talk about capacity factor for these different installations, the question you have to always ask is, well, where are they and how are they being utilized? You mentioned Kawaii Island Utility Cooperative, and my friend Brad Rockwell, who's one of the main manager of the grid system there. They also use biomass, and which is one of the few places in the world where they can use a biomass to electricity plant, because they have very, it's sunny and very temperate, so they can grow was it some kind of miscanthus or something that they grow, and they can feed right into the boilers.
Eucalyptus tree is what I recall.
But they use that as a peaker plant, so they don't use that biomass except times when they really need it. So and also, by the way, the city of Austin spent $400 million on a biomass plant that didn't produce a single watt hour of electricity during the blizzard.
So I was going to talk about wind, because you're an opponent of wind, and I'm sure similar to me. The biggest problem with wind is that no one ever talks about what the trade-offs are. But you mentioned biomass, and the biggest learning I had, which was the shock of all shocks, watching A Planet of Humans by Michael Moore. I'm sure you've seen it. For someone as liberal as he was to come out with that movie, I was shocked. But in particular, the fact that we call burning trees, which are carbon events, we burn them, and that somehow is renewable because we can offset them by planting new ones, which presumably you could do with coal or natural gas or oil. But it seems like that one is a little bit like sketchy, and that like it's the dirty secret of renewables. Am I overreacting to that movie and that take?
No, you're not. I'm old enough to know or remember when environmentalists like to keep trees upright, and now the idea is, because of climate change, we're going to cut them down. I'm just like, wait a minute, what are you doing? And so now that I think it's at Teesside in England, one of the plants over there has been converted to biomass. So they're shipping trees from the United States to burn in a boiler in England so that they can claim some carbon benefit. I mean, it's just crazy town. It just is total crazy town. And yet this is where we are in this debate. And I want to come back to nuclear because I'm adamantly pro-nuclear and I want to see it grow. And there's some very promising technologies that are being developed now, molten salt reactors, ship-based reactors, using ships as power ships, reactors on power ships, where you could have 1,000 megawatts of nuclear power moored and at Beirut or in Basra or any number of the coastal cities around the world that desperately need more electricity, and we'll be able to produce it on a very small footprint. That's the direction that we, and I'm using the papal we, the collective we here, makes the most sense. But we have to get on with it, and that's going to take a decade or more, maybe 2 decades. But in the meantime, it's clear that if we're serious then about electrification, providing more power to more people, it's going to be natural gas because it's low carbon, scalable, affordable, modular, and the resources are super abundant.
So let us talk a little bit more about wind, because it's the most obvious source everybody sees, these huge turbines, which is amazing. If you see them in the distance in the field, you don't get the enormity of it until you drive by a truck on the highway pulling a single blade. It's incredible. When you think about the good, because clearly there's some good from wind, and when you think about the trade-offs of wind, what do you talk about? Like, what are your key talking points on wind?
My view of the wind industry is based in my decade, or now more than a decade, of interviewing rural landowners who've been effectively run over by the wind business, some of whom have had to abandon their homes. And those people are just forgotten. I don't use this term very often, and I don't really like it, but these liberal coastal elites, and particularly the academic elites, who are saying, oh, we'll just put a whole, hundreds of gigawatts of wind out there and fly over country. It's the vacant land myth. It's very similar to this kind of manifest destiny that was part of the settlement of the American West. Oh, those Indians out there, they're not using the land. We'll use it. We're going to put it to productive use. Well, the same kind of sneering attitude, and that's what it is. It's a sneering kind of attitude about those people out there. Oh, well, they just don't know what's good for them. But I've interviewed too many people who've abandoned their homes, or who are suffering in their own homes because of the wind, the noise from the wind turbines, or the shadow flicker. These are real people, and I've interviewed them, and I've interviewed local community leaders, politicians in these small towns fighting the wind business. And yet they're completely ignored by the big environmental groups, Sierra Club, Audubon, Natural Resources Defense Council. They don't count. They don't even figure in the calculus of these grandiose plans about converting our entire energy and power systems over to renewables. Oh, we're just going to put it out there in Indian country, in that vacant land. No. There's no such thing. People all over the world care about their neighborhoods. They care about their counties, and they're going to fight to protect them. And I perfectly understand that. So there are a lot of issues around the wind business. And you said I'm an opponent. I'm a critic, and I'm a critic that has been at this for a long time because of the human impacts that I've seen. And those human impacts have touched my heart in a way that it's hard for me to explain. But Google Dave Enz, E-N-Z, and read on my website his story about abandoning his home in Denmark, Wisconsin. Might change your view on this whole idea of green wind.
What is the flicker shadow? I have not heard that phrase before.
Shadow flicker is when the sun will, if your house is over here and the sun is over there, and the wind turbine is in between you, then the turning of the blades creates a stroboscopic. No, what is it?
Yeah, like going to a nightclub. You're going and
exactly. A strobing effect that causes the light in your house to flicker for hours at a time. And so, yeah, this has occurred with neighbors of wind turbines all over the country, and you can find videos on YouTube showing this stroboscopic effect.
Okay, so let's go to the most vilified source. We're going to end in oil and gas when we get on this journey, but we're going to talk about coal. And so we already talked about rare earth from China. We talked about some of the labor practices in China. I always find this amazing, even just like using the Canadian oil sands example versus the Saudi Arabian example. And I thought it was particularly enlightening. And I don't want anyone to get mad at me for saying this, but like the US government determined what everyone knew, that Jamal Khashoggi was ordered to be
murdered and dismembered.
Was ordered to be murdered. Now, Alan Wald, who writes Wald Wednesday for us, had a great article this week that Jamal Khashoggi's citizenship status, everyone assumed he was a U.S. citizen, but he's not. I thought that was interesting. But take that aside. We basically knew that the leader of Saudi Arabia ordered his murder, and the decision was we actually can supply sanctions to them because the oil is too important. And I find that amazingly hypocritical, given that Canada is moving so hard against their natural resources in the oil sands, and the US, even with the 60-day executive order to look at federal lands, but this objection to using federal lands for oil and gas, and yet, as you said, no talk of the wind, the open country that we're destroying there. But all of this comes back to coal and China and access to rare earth. 57% of China's electric grid, the electricity is provided by coal, and they seem to be building that out all the time. In Texas, we decommissioned 20 coal plants since 2011, which no doubt had a contributing factor to the power issue that happened 2 weeks ago. What is your take on the role coal can play, should play? What do we need to do to make coal better, and maybe have an open conversation about it?
Well, let me zoom out for just a second, David, and point out that for all of the talk about the death of coal, the reality is that coal continues to provide globally between 35 and 40% of all the electricity produced in the world. So while the US and Western Europe are saying, we're going to abandon coal, we don't need coal, we're going to go clean, do other things, other countries are not just relying on coal, they're building new power plants fueled with coal, including Japan, the home of the Kyoto Protocol. And what Japan is doing is they're building some of the latest designs, including ultra supercritical. So they're getting the enthalpic efficiency of the combustion is greater. They're getting something like 40% of the thermal energy out of the coal and converting it into electricity. And the emissions are very clean. So Japan has realized they have to shut a lot of their nuclear plants in the wake of Fukushima. And they're going to follow the path that makes sense for their economy, which includes using coal, and a lot of it sourced out of Australia. So at the same time, India, China, developing countries in throughout Asia, they're building new coal plants, and a lot of them. So this idea that we're going to be in a post-coal environment in just a few years, no, it's going to be decades. As far as the United States, coal is being displaced for a lot of reasons. One is the political risk of the issue of coal ash, the financeability. A lot of big financing entities, including the big banks, multilateral lenders, and so on, won't finance coal plants anymore. And so it's effectively impossible today to build a coal plant in the United States. That said, if we're serious about resilience and reliability, coal makes a lot of sense. And the U.S. isn't just the Saudi Arabia of coal. We're the OPEC of coal. We have more coal than any other country in the world by far. And that was what the message of Jimmy Carter, if you way back when in the late 1970s, the U.S. was convinced that they were running, everyone was convinced that we're running out of natural gas. And Carter said, we need to use more coal. And that's what happened. And now today we're shutting some of those same coal plants that were built in response to that perception of shortage of natural gas back in the 70s. So I'm fascinated by the coal business, but I don't see much future for it here in the United States.
Well, what I find most interesting about coal, to your point, is I'm not even advocating building more necessarily, as much as I am keeping the existing capacity we have and figuring out how it can play a role. Because again, I would anticipate what happened in Texas and what happened in California a year ago, which again, in California, they jumped right on the utilities, but a lot of it, as I understand, is bad forest management. We're building houses in places that we necessarily shouldn't be. because electricity is so cheap. We all have 6 TVs and 7 iPads and Teslas, and so that the demands we put on the system are so massive, and the cost is never borne by consumers. It just seems to me that shutting coal plants versus leaving them there for the next 10, 15 years while we get a better solution, whatever that is, would make a lot of sense. And you said the political risk is very high.
Well, let me just touch on one point that you made there, because this is the critical one, David. And it was just in the last, I think it was the beginning of March, where Pacific Gas and Electric, their rate increase took effect in California. I think it was an 8.1% electricity rate increase for PG&E customers. That rate increase was approved by the California Public Utility Commission a day or so after the cities of San Jose and Oakland announced they were going to ban the use of natural gas in future buildings in those cities. So they're going to ban natural gas and force consumers to use more electricity, and they're doing it at the very same time electricity rates in California, which are already among the highest in the country, are going higher. And there was just a new report came out from the California Public Utility Commission just a few days ago saying those rates are headed higher still. So amidst all the things that we've talked about, and I love this stuff and I know you do as well, the thing that I'm increasingly concerned about are consumers, and particularly low and middle income consumers who don't have any political stroke. They don't know where to go to complain. They don't know how to read their electric bill, but they are about to see massive increases in the cost of their energy if we continue down this path of demonizing every hydrocarbon and saying you may not use it, in fact, prohibiting their consumption in the home for home water heating, for home clothes drying, for cooking. I mean, these are critical functions in the home, and they're cheap with gas. They're 4 times as expensive with electricity. 4 times on average, electricity costs more on a per unit of energy basis than natural gas.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about that, the natural gas tap ban, because I think to your point, it's fascinating. And I read this. So high efficiency natural gas furnaces for forced air heating has a 90% efficiency of the heat conversion. Now, a power plant, as you talked about, 30, 40, 50%, pick your number. But the thought about, you're green, you have a Tesla, you plug it in, or you're using natural gas to heat your home or wind, but in natural gas, you have a power plant, the natural gas goes in, you create steam, the steam turns a turbine, which creates the power, which then is delivered through a transmission line with lots of losses. By the converse of that is natural gas delivered directly to your home into your furnace is 90% efficient at creating heat. It seems absolutely illogical that we would want to see more electrification of heating. I would want to see more natural gas used in heating purely from an efficiency standpoint. Why has this movement to ban natural gas taps in new buildings, where has that come from? Who is the enemy that's pushing that?
Well, if you're looking for the instigators, you need to go out to Snowmass and talk to the folks at the Rocky Mountain Institute there west of Denver. This is the electrify everything push that is one of the prime groups behind that. One of the main groups behind that is Rocky Mountain Institute, along with the Sierra Club. You can go on the Sierra Club's website and see their list of all the California communities. I think it's 42 now that have banned or restricted the use of natural gas. But Rocky Mountain Institute has been one of the leaders in this. And in fact, they are one of the leaders in trying to organize cities in the state of Massachusetts to ban natural gas in buildings. So, and they're getting, by the way, they just got a grant from the Bezos Earth Fund of about $10 million to support that work. So there is a lot of money being given to the groups that are pursuing this agenda. And it's the demonization of gas in the home. I have to say, as a journalist, I've been pretty impressed by the way the media outreach on this has happened, because you've seen a bunch of stories about the dangers of gas in your home and, oh, you can't have this, and indoor air pollution and the rest of it. The reality is this. I looked these numbers up. It's available on EIA's website. I'll quiz you. Since 1970, has the amount of gas in U.S. residential, the residential consumption of natural gas in the U.S., has it gone down, gone up, or stayed the same?
I would assume it's gone up. That would be my guess.
It hasn't budged in 50
Interesting.
years. In 50 years, at a time when the US population has grown by about 50%, we've gone from about 200 million to about 330 million. The amount of natural gas used in residential in the residential sector in the United States has stayed at 5 trillion cubic feet a year.
Wow.
And yet it is being demonized now as part of this climate change push. And yet it's like, well, is this the best target? Is this the best use of your money? But this is one of the tactics that is being used by these groups because they can claim a win. Oh, well, we claim a win. See, Mr. Funder, we claimed a win. Here, give us some more money because we're winning. And that's the impacts on humans, on consumers, on low-income people are not considered because it's all about the prestige of the groups that are pushing this agenda.
Well, I also looked up online because when I've read about this, can you even is there such thing as a commercial stove that's electric? I mean, if you talk to anyone who makes food, they love their gas. And you would go into a house to buy it and you would be like, I want the gas. And I would have said, like, I used to love the wood fire, but there is nothing better than a natural gas fire, like just to hang out by, or a fire bowl in the back. Like, it's very desirable to have that access to energy. It is shocking, and as you said, it marginalizes poor people, which is amazing because the coronavirus did the same thing. 10% of households hold 90% of assets, and since the lows, the S&P is up more than 50%. So the rich, who already can work from home, have college degrees, have all the power they need. It doesn't matter if their utility bill goes up 10 or 20%. Their choices are, should I buy the $150 bottle of wine at dinner or the 100? And these are the people making decisions to save the climate on the back of the people who, like, an additional 30 cents a gallon on their gas or 10 cents on their utility bills means they can't pay their rent. And those are the people, as you said, who have no political stroke. How do we reach out to that voter and talk about the value of affordable energy? How do we access them without being big bad energy companies, whoever you advocate for?
Well, I think this is the key message here, is that as I see it, the politics in America anymore, they're not so much left, right as they are top to bottom, right? That there is, and Joel Kotkin, who I quite admire, he's a demographer, and I follow his work closely. He's written a terrific book. I had him on my podcast. It's called the neo serfdom. No, it was neo. I have the book here at hand. Anyway, Joel Kotkin, he's talked about this in particular in California, about the class division in California, that there is a distinct class division within the political parties. And so that the Democrats, strangely, who profess to be the party of the poor and the working class, are now really the party of the elites. And the Republicans, is one of the reasons why Trump was so attractive to rural folks and people in the lower part of the economic spectrum, was that he was talking about working class issues and low cost energy. And that's never something that you'd heard come out of Joe Biden's mouth. It just, oh, well, we're going to create jobs and electric vehicles. And one of the debates, he says, we need to eliminate all internal combustion engines. Well, okay. So if you're a tradesman, a plumber, a carpenter, a sheetrocker, a painter, you drive a truck, you drive an F-150, you don't drive a Tesla. You drive a Silverado or a Dodge Ram, and it's with a V8 because you're hauling lumber or pipe or something else, or whatever. Those people are never going to buy a Tesla. They're never. It's not going to happen. And yet they're going to be forced to pay for EV charging stations. They're being forced to pay, as in California, subsidies for wealthy residents who are buying EVs and getting priority access to the HOV lanes on the freeway. So there's a class element that, to me, is the issue that people in the energy sector who are serious need to focus on, because this is not about Republican and Democrats. It's about the poor and the middle class having a fair shake.
It is the subsidies to buy a Tesla. I remember it was a couple of years ago. I think it's expired, but perhaps it hasn't. I know for solar panels, there's still a lot of subsidies, but you buy a Tesla, there's $100,000 car, at least before the Model 3, and you get $7,000 or $8,000 back. I mean, that's coming out of taxes. It seems crazy. And yet the Tesla owners don't appreciate that if their power in Wyoming, 89% of the power created is from coal. Everyone in Wyoming appreciates and understands the coal industry, so no one's saying they're plugging in their Tesla and they're running on green energy. But why do you think that A, people haven't figured that out, and B, I want to talk about carbon taxes because
Right.
the API recently came out this week saying that they're kind of supporting a carbon tax. And what I don't understand and why I don't support it is because, so are we going to put a carbon tax on Saudi Arabian imports, on Canadian imports? Who pays those? Then the natural gas and oil producers as a baseload energy, we are dependent on spot pricing. Yet I've seen most of these solar and wind contracts is like a purchase price agreement at a fixed cost for a fixed rate of return over a fixed period of time, and you must take that electricity whenever they generate it. So it's a totally deregulated fixed return market, but it also has a carbon footprint because you need to make, the steel for windmills, the electric arc furnace that's required to make solar panels. And then you use a Tesla using those power sources to generate your electricity. How does all of that come together in a cohesive way that carbon taxes should be put in, will be put in, don't be put in, and then how do Tesla payers pay for it?
Sure. Well, let me jump back a little bit on the EV issue, because this is something that I've reported on and to me is quite interesting. And on the podcast, I have twice had Assemblyman Jim Cooper from Elk Grove, California. He's in the California Assembly, and he's one of the moderate Democrats in the Assembly in California. He's a retired sheriff or deputy sheriff, one of the first mayors of the city of Elk Grove, and he's a Black representative, African American guy. He's so passionate about the issue of EV subsidies in California because he's looked at where the Senate districts that are collecting, there's one Senate district in the Bay Area that has collected more in EV subsidies than 7 or 8 other Senate districts combined. He said, we're taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich. This is wrong. And so, again, this is a class issue that can be seen over this whole thing of decarbonizing transportation. Well, all you're doing is taking money from poor folks and giving it to the rich. That's just bad policy. And so he's been speaking up on it. Unfortunately, he's vastly outnumbered in the California Assembly when it comes to this realization or this understanding of how this flawed policy. Carbon tax. I've written a lot about it, and in my third book, Gusher of Lies, I have a long section about it. I supported the carbon tax a long time ago, and then I sobered up. This idea that we're going to pass a carbon tax in the United States, and then we're going to harmonize all of our imports based on their carbon content, and then charge a tariff on that. It's just setting up a system that is bound to fail and bound to be gamed. My first book was on Enron. You think the traders aren't going to salivate at the idea of doing something with these? Oh, we'll trade you carbon credits. Look at what happened with the carbon tax in Washington that was proposed and voted down by voters. Who was exempted? Oh, Boeing, all the big aluminum smelters. The big business is always going to find a way to make a big tax program like that work for them and against the interests of the consumers. Last point. The idea that we're going to impose a carbon tax and somehow that we're going to pass it internationally and it's all going to work. Okay. Explain it to me slowly, because I'm from Tulsa. I'm kind of slow. We don't have an international agreement to ban landmines. How do you think we're going to, that there's something like 30 different countries, including the United States, that haven't signed on to the international agreement to ban landmines? If we can't ban landmines, why do you think we're going to have an ability to pass an internationally harmonized carbon tax where countries like Vietnam and India and Bangladesh and Pakistan is, oh, yeah, sure. We're going to pay more for our energy. It's not going to happen.
Well, so the two challenges I have with carbon tax, so get your input on this, is number one, at least as it's been imposed in Canada, they sort of say everyone's going to pay, but then the lower income people are going to get a rebate. So it's not even about changing demand per se, because the rich people can afford it and they don't care. And the poor people then get a check. So then they're like, ooh, the government's giving me money. So it's not even reducing carbon, which the way at least I've seen it implemented. Curious your feedback to that.
Well, first, this idea, oh, we're going to pass a carbon tax and then we're going to roll back all these other regulations and everything's going to be great. And this is going to be the way we handle all this. There's no way the states and the local governments are going to give up their authority to meddle in, let's call it what it is, meddle in the energy markets. There's just no way. This idea, oh, well, this is going to be the thing and we're going to then quit all this other monkeying around with energy policy. I was born at night. I wasn't born last night. Second, the idea that it's going to be great for the poor, or how do you make that fair for, say, a tradesman who I live in Texas. This is a big state. And somebody who lives in Segovia, Texas, a little place out, west of here, about 150 miles, who's a tradesman who drives 200 miles a day as part of his work, versus a low-income resident in Brooklyn who doesn't have a car. You're going to give them the same check? It's not. That doesn't work. You're having a tradesman, a carpenter who's driving 200 miles a day, call it 100 miles a day. His burden, his energy burden, is far greater under that carbon tax regime than someone who's living in New York and riding the subway to work at a service job. So there's just no way to make it equitable without, oh, everybody submit your receipts and here, file this form. And, the people, working class folks, don't have time to navigate all that stuff. It's one of these, the carbon tax is a perfect solution for an imperfect world.
Well, and the second thing that I really get frustrated about, and it's related to government. Even in all the conversation we just had, you assume a perfectly efficient, you can file the documents, there's no cheating, you're buying it, you're selling it, but we've seen New York, the entire city of New York exists to find fund flow. And so I always use the example of ESG, and that the real reason people weren't owning oil and gas companies was because A, we weren't profitable, B, we had a huge amount of debt, and C, we were overvalued. And so the hedge fund managers in New York are not stupid. They say, oh, I can't own you because of ESG. Well, between November 9th, when the vaccine announcement came out, and today, many oil and gas stocks are up 1,000%. 2,000%, because people in New York don't care. They just want to move their money into something that's going to generate return. So my biggest concern about the carbon tax regulation is someone's going to run it, and those are the ones who are going to get rich. They're going to strip out their profitability, their transmission, it's like people installing wind. $3 trillion in the Green New Deal, I always say, is 30% rate of return for everyone up to the consumer. And then the consumer is going to pay more for it because it's a fixed regulated rate of return. So I don't trust it. Do you agree that the carbon tax, even the machinations of how you'd set up the market, lead to fraud like Enron?
Well, again, who will benefit from this? It's the traders. It's big business. It's not going to be the merchant on Main Street. It's not going to be the tradesman. I'm somewhat reluctant to quote Phil Gramm, a senator from Texas from several years ago, but he had an analogy, a story that he would tell, which I think is actually pretty good. He said, when I'm looking at some legislation, I think about my barber, and it's barber, if I remember, his name was Dickie Flat. He said, if I'm looking at this policy, I want to know how it affects Dickie Flat. And if it doesn't help Dickie Flat, I'm not interested. And that has been lost in this discussion of this belief in the Green New Deal and these other things, that carbon is the only concern. Greenhouse gases, climate change are the only concern. We need to completely turn society upside down to go to net zero. Well, okay, that's what your goal is. How would it affect the barber in Lockhart, Texas? How does it affect the plumber in Segovia, Texas, or in Claremore, Oklahoma? That's of more concern to me than the climate, I have to say. That how does it affect people, and what is it going to do to their income and their ability to improve their lot? Because that's the American promise. And that's Joel Kotkin's point, is that the big divide in America is now really around energy, and between the energy producing states and the non-energy producing states. And you see this in Colorado, where your state has been turned solidly blue, and you're now facing in Colorado regulations that aim to shut the oil and gas industry down completely, including new regulations I saw the other day on eliminating natural gas in the city of Denver, which I looked at that and I thought, this is deeply crazy.
Well, and so as an aside, before I ask you the last question, I've been chatting about this, and 80,000 residents a year move into Colorado, and 75% of those are for California. So if you go back to 2016, the last election where 3 million voters voted, we've added 400,000 voters, of which 300,000 are from California, which you know are the mobile urban elite folk who are Democrat. That's a 10% swing on the voter. So when people want to know how we went from a purple state to a solidly blue state, it's because a whole bunch of Californians are evacuating some of the policies there and then bringing their politics to Colorado or to Arizona, where we've seen a switch,
Right.
or to Nevada, or to Texas, where we've seen a switch. And I think that that's going to be a big issue, because that they're not living with the consequences of these bans, but they're winning on the environmental front.
Well, and apparently the same thing happened here. Elon Musk used to live in California. Oracle was in California. They moved to Texas and brought the blackouts with them.
So that was going to be where I want to close the discussion today, because I want to talk about Tesla. And Tesla, I've written about it extensively, and I differentiate the car, which is a great, phenomenal car. I differentiate that from the valuation and the cult status of the company. And I do find it interesting, as there's been a rotation out of high growth, high multiple stocks. Tesla's down about 35% from the highs at this point, as energy stocks have come up. But the reason S&P added Tesla to their index was because they are profitable for 4 quarters in a row, and they were the 4th largest company in the country. That profitability came from selling EV credits that California mandated, so that they sold 390 million of credits against 370 of income, which means they make zero money from selling cars. They make money on Bitcoin, which is energy intensive, and selling credits. I'm curious, when you look at that, why there hasn't been more of a pile-on effect for, we've created the 4th largest company by market cap in the United States, and it's been done on the heels of tax subsidies and transfers to the rich. What do you make of that?
It is amazing. And, just a quick comment, because Tesla is now building a factory. In fact, a friend of mine is working as a welder on the construction crew, building the Tesla factory here in Austin. They're going to build this new electric truck. Apparently, the starting price is going to be $49,000. Now, I haven't looked at it closely, but I am not at all convinced that tradesmen, and I've talked a lot about them, plumbers, contractors, carpenters, are going to be buying that vehicle. And yet they got tax credits from the city, from the Del Valley School District, and from, I believe, from Travis County, amounting to millions of dollars. Why? Why are we subsidizing one of this massively rich company and one of the richest people in America, Elon Musk, so he can build a factory that's going to build luxury pickup trucks for people who want to have an electric car? It just grates my cheese. I just don't understand that at all. It's nuts. But this is the way the system works now. It's, a friend of mine, he was at the Austin Chronicle, the newspaper where I used to work, and he said, I'm all in favor of capitalism. I just like to see it work every now and then.
Oh, well, and I think that the dirty little secret about Tesla, and I wrote it, some friends, my son is on a hockey team, and they drove from Denver to Omaha, and they decided to take their model, the SUV one, the Gold Wing, they decided to drive it. Because it was so cold, and this was the week of the power outages, the battery life of the Tesla fell in half. So their range, instead of 350, was 175. On top of that, the heat source is a switch, and the switch broke halfway through. So they had to buy 10 blankets, and they were thinking about abandoning the car because it was something like 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the car, because there was no heat source, and the battery was sucking down double the speed. So they had to stop 3 times for 30 minutes to power up the vehicle, and they were scraping the inside because of the lack of heat. Now, that is a one-off case. But if we want to manage Teslas in Canada when it's cold, and all of a sudden there's huge heat demand, and you need to charge your car twice as frequently, and the only source of power at that time is natural gas and coal and nuclear, because it's not windy in the winter and it's not sunny at night, we have a whole bunch of issues that are just swept under the carpet and never talked about. So I absolutely love what you do. If you don't listen to Robert Bryce's podcast, the Power Hungry podcast, it's the most informative one, and it's the one I always carve out time to listen to. I know a tremendous number of fans. The best way to get the message out for him, if you've listened, go on to Apple or Spotify and write a review. Use your words, give him a 5-star review, because he is pushing a very, very important point that all energy is good energy, and that we need to be focused on nuclear, even though it's more expensive, if we want to get to a decarbonized future. Robert, did I miss anything in that?
David, that was a fine speech and a remarkable story about the Tesla. And the next time your son goes on the road in the wintertime, make sure he's driving an internal combustion vehicle, because I wouldn't risk my life. I mean, that would be a truly dangerous situation that those kids were in. And kind of horrifying, honestly. But anyway, you've been very kind to invite me, David, and very flattering. I'm thrilled to talk with you, and as you like you, I'm passionate about it. So let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. And when you think about the levelized cost of energy, I'm looking over your left shoulder and I'm seeing what looks to be a Fender Telecaster, if I'm correct, which is an electric guitar. And even though the electrical footprint of an acoustic is different than an electric, there's reasons you need an acoustic. Sometimes you're by the fire, you're trying to impress a girl, and sometimes it's an electric because you're not by a fire and you're trying to impress a boy. So with that, thank you everyone for listening. I'm a huge fan of Robert Bryce. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.